Okay, hopefully you have, a result of that last piece, you have a little bit deeper understanding about the way that perceived threat works in our lives and the way the autonomic nervous system responds involuntarily to those perceived threats and just how ubiquitous perceived threats are in our lives. I'm really clear, and have been for 20 years, that that's the true cause of compassion fatigue. And you see, the kind of purpose of what I just, like, the reason why I do that psychoeducational piece with my clients, with professionals, is that until they understand that and embody that, really, then they believe that all these factors are the cause, that the cause of their distress is external. And what they do is they dedicate all of their resources, internal and external, towards fixing those external things, towards trying to make work so that it doesn't scare them. Their finances, enough money that they're not perceiving threat anymore, that, to not watch the news, to avoid family members that make them uncomfortable, to build conflict in relationships, to manage threat of intimacy. It's all about kind of manipulating the environment becomes the only way to have quality of life. But once you get it, that it's not your work schedule, that it's not the angry patients that you're working with, it's not the low pay that is causing the distress in your body. It's what's going on in your body while you're encountering those situations. So once you get that, then there opens up this whole different vector of improving quality of life. Because until you get that it's not an external causation, that this stuff out there is not producing your distress, it's internal causation. It's what your body's doing. Now you got power. Now you got traction. Now you can begin to manage what you have control over. Focus on what you have, where you have power, instead of trying to control what's beyond your control and become demoralized and it just continue to be. You can't get the world in the shape that it's not going to scare you anymore. You can't do that. Which brings me to this place where I can hopefully say now, I can say it with authority. I hope that you can hear it this way. I hope you can hear this with loving kindness. None of you watching this have a stressful job. Your job is not stressful. I say that to a room full of nurses, and when I do keynotes at nursing conventions, and there's this delicious 1 second of suspension where they just look at me like this. Like, did he really just say that? And then they erupt. And it takes 30 or 40 seconds before I can talk anymore. And just because they get angry with me doesn't abdicate my responsibility for telling them that. Your job's not stressful. Your job's a haunted house. And what happens, you go to work and you got stuff jumping out at you all day long, stuff you're encountering all day. And because of your painful past learning, what's happening is you are unconsciously imbuing those things you encounter, their sensory experiences similar to painful past learning, and you're perceiving those situations here in the present as a threat. And your body's responding exactly the way an animal's body's supposed to respond when it's perceiving a threat. It's juicing you full of energy. And you're not regulating that energy. What are you doing? You're just muscling your way through the confrontation with every single perceived threat through the day. More energy, brute forcing, grinding your way through the day. It's hurting you. It's causing symptoms. So, that is, I have clarity. I love that, claro, Spanish word for that. Truth. I have clarity that is the cause of compassion fatigue. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to break down compassion fatigue, and that the antidote to compassion fatigue is learning how to regulate your autonomic nervous system, which we're going to get into, I promise you today, the solution. But what I want to do now is take half an hour, 40 minutes, and walk you through kind of the more traditional understanding of what compassion fatigue is and how that works, and start to weave in what you've learned already and how these two different pathways produce the perception of threat: secondary traumatic stress and burnout. You do research in compassion fatigue, you kind of have to address, there's lots of these different camps that talk about it. I'm on a dissertation committee for a woman in Montana right now who's doing her dissertation on this, and she is championing the agenda of looking at the workshop as effectiveness for one thing, but kind of one of the sub agendas of her dissertation is to call for compassion fatigue to be the one rubric that just captures all of this instead of having these different points of view. I'm not going to go into that in a one-day training. I do a 2-day compassion fatigue certification training that is available through Ptsd, and I break this stuff out. Spend a lot of time with it, but for today, I want to spend just a little bit of time in what Charles identified as what compassion fatigue is, and when he wrote the book in 1995, and still is the model for what compassion fatigue is today, 25 years later. And it is the combined effects of secondary trauma plus burnout. And again, looking at the way those two things are similar and different, that the cause of secondary traumatic stress is witnessing or interacting with traumatized or suffering people. The symptoms of secondary traumatic stress are almost identical to those of PTSD. What's different is criterion A, the event. But they have the same anxiety, avoidance, distortions of perception that come with PTSD. It is gradual and cumulative instead of PTSD. Person has a motor vehicle accident at 35. They did not have PTSD. One day they have the motor vehicle accident. Next day they have PTSD. Secondary traumatic stress, gradual and cumulative. And the way that you resolve secondary traumatic stress is behavioral resolution. There are some things that you have to do, which I'll get into, and resiliency, which I'm going to call self-regulation. Is the primary element of resilience, being able to interrupt the threat response and then do some specific things about getting those secondary traumatic stress memories desensitized and integrated, which I'll talk about here in just a second. And that's contrasted with burnout, which is the cause in the literature is the demanding and toxic environments. What I'm going to lead you on, hopefully, is a pathway to help you to see that it's not the environment that's causing burnout, but the perception of the environment that's causing burnout. And the symptoms of burnout, it's an interesting kind of curve, a continuum for most people, not true for everybody. But at the front end of burnout, it's usually anxiety and irritability, a lot energy. But then on the back end, it ends up with shutdown, and it looks like hopelessness and flatness and limping to the finish line of retirement. And what's different is where there are some specific behavioral interventions to do with secondary traumatic stress. With burnout, it's more perceptual. It's getting the body relaxed so you have neocortical functioning, so you can change the perceptions of the workplace to make the workplace less toxic. And so that ends up being where we're headed. So let's do that, kind of zoom through this pretty quickly because it's a little bit more didactic. So I'm going to fire through it. Bob and I started writing about 5 years ago. Bob Roten is the CEO and owner of Arizona Trauma Institute. And I moved out here to Arizona 3 years ago for us to work together because we were pretty kindred spirits. And we started kind of conceptualizing, him more than me, he was the one that really put this together more than I did, was this whole idea around traumagenesis. And here's traumagenesis explained in 3 pictures, the best 3 I could find. And so we have a person who is a dog lover. And that dog lover gets attacked by a German Shepherd one day. Once they have been attacked by a German Shepherd, then they're not just afraid of German Shepherds. That aperture now opens up, and now that perception of threat has been generalized to all dogs. And that's kind of what traumagenesis is that painful, threatening, traumatic experiences in the past turn into the perception of threat here in the present. If you want to really define what PTSD is, that's what PTSD is. What causes the symptoms of PTSD is the perception of threat here in the environment, here in the present environment, where there's little or no danger. Why? Because the trauma of the past is intruding here into the present, hijacking the perceptual system, causing the person to perceive threat and having all of that physiological response. And that's what's causing symptoms of PTSD. And there are 3 ways that can happen. 3 pathways for traumagenesis. There is post-traumatic stress, something that we encountered or witnessed in real time. So, that may be, workplace. Let's do that in the workplace. That may be a workplace shooting or any workplace violence that you encounter. It may be a patient threatening you. It may be, for a physician, that may be you work in a code and the person dying. Those are post-traumatic experiences. Those you survived it or you witnessed it happening in vivo. Then there is the secondary traumatic stress, which is the witnessing of it through either story or media. So hearing people talk about that you work at the place and somebody was attacked. You weren't even at work that day, but you hear your coworkers talking about it, and you starting to visualize that experience turns into traumatic stress. Hearing narratives of trauma, of witnessing it through media exposure, and that's secondary traumatic stress. Then there is this more subtle environmental or ambient. And this goes to the work of mostly, there's several people that worked on it, but the person that sticks out the most for me that's done the formative work on this is Dan Siegel around mirror neurons. And what happens is that human beings are wired to read threat response in other human beings. So if you're around somebody who's having a threat response, so do you, involuntarily. If you're around people who are jacked up, then your threat response is activating. And if you're around those people, how anxious are the people you work with? Well, there you see, that's what the environmental process is. That if you're working with people and you're spending 8 hours or longer a day with people who are chronically dysregulated, then chances are you are too. You're just not aware of it. You've learned to dissociate your awareness from your body. And if you want to be healthy in that environment where everybody else is stressed out, then you have to start intentionally interrupting your threat response while you're around people, because we are genetically, physiologically encoded to activate when other people are perceiving threat. It's what made human beings make it to the top of the food chain, is that we can work in community and be able to have that awareness to respond to dangers as a community that everybody activated around that. It's over adaptation for today, but it was pretty useful, 40 or 60 or 80,000 years ago. So those are the three ways you can get traumatized. You can survive it, you can witness it, or you can be around other people who are traumatized. Those are the three pathways to get traumatized. This is rapid onset, frequently, happening right after the trauma. These are gradual onset. Now, to demonstrate the way this works, I frequently, I'm going to show a picture right now that is mildly triggering, mildly. So if you have a low threshold for that, then you may want to turn away from the screen, and then you can just put drape something over the screen, and you can still hear the audio. But I'm going to put that up in 5 seconds. So if you want to cover that, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And you see, this is a picture of a young boy who is, don't know exactly the context. It could be a hospital. It could be, I don't even remember where I found this image. But it's a boy who's clearly in pain. And he's looks like that he's been injured. And he's screaming, and it looks like he's asking for help. What I'm going to ask you to do is for those of you that are looking at the screen right now, I'm going to ask you for the next 10 seconds to just focus on the screen and looking at that picture. Now, what's happening in your body? Scan your body. What do you notice happening while you're looking at that picture? What are the muscles in your body doing? And most of you will find, once you weren't aware because all your attention was on the environment, you were looking at the picture, you probably weren't paying much attention to your body, but now as you intentionally do interoception, put your awareness in your body, you're finding that you have probably more than one group of muscles in your body that are constricted while you're looking at this picture. And I say to physicians, when I show this picture to physicians, I say, what do you suppose is happening in your body when all the sensory channels, this is just one sensory channel, this is just visual. This is a two-dimensional picture on a screen, and you're having a threat response to it. That's kind of profound. What do you suppose is happening when all the sensory channels are happening, when you're hearing the screams, when you're smelling the smells, and you are yoked with the responsibility for making that screaming stop? What do you suppose is happening in your body then? You don't know, do you? Because all your attention has been focused in that threat response. All your attention is focused on the environment, and you've not been aware, therefore unable to interrupt your own threat response. That's how secondary traumatic stress works. And one of these experiences is probably not going to produce secondary traumatic stress. But anybody who is watching this, who has worked in an emergency department, this is, there's 20 of these in a shift, or 40 of these in a shift. That it's pretty constant exposure. That if you're not consistently regulating, then you're going to absorb that secondary traumatic stress that is gradually going to have, it's a gradual symptom development process. And one of the physicians that became one of the facilitators, she works in a hospital in inner city San Francisco. And she articulates it this way, pretty nice. That she says, not every pregnancy ends up in complication and bleeding. But almost every pregnancy I see does. Not every bicycle ride ends up with a closed head injury. A lot of them I see do. Not every home improvement project ends up with a missing digit. A lot of them that I see in the ER do. That's the outcome of the home improvement project. What do you suppose Larissa's job has done to her perception of the world as an emergency physician? How has it changed the way that she sees the world? It's become a progressively dangerous place. That's what happens when people get traumatized, is they perceive the environment as much more threatening because all of this is intruding into their perceptual system, causing them to perceive mundane situations now as threatening. I have a friend who was a colonel in the Air Force Reserves now, who ran a lot of the forward evacs during the Iraqi freedom. She now is executive director, or the director of a couple of different emergency departments, professor at the University of Colorado in Colorado Springs. And, I've done a lot of work with her there. And what I discovered when I was in Colorado Springs is that's Fort Carson, I think, there. And a lot of folks returned from combat. That was where they came back to. And a lot of folks are stationed there after having been in combat in either Iraq or Afghanistan. And one of the leading traffic infractions that folks get tickets for in Colorado Springs is driving left of center. Why? Because of IDs. And what happens is that they learn, you get blown up, that the IDs are on the side of the road. So what they learn to do in Afghanistan and Iraq is to drive in the middle of the road. So the intrusion of the combat experiences causes them unconsciously to drive in the center of the road. That's the way that works. There are not very many IDs in Colorado Springs, but the perception of them as a result of that combat experience has turned it into a perceived threat for those combat veterans. That's the way that works. These symptoms are subtle in secondary, is that they gradually increase. So what happens with secondary traumatic stress, it's hard to see in our own selves because the shift is gradual. And it's usually our friends or our loved ones or family that see it before we do. And toward that end, 15, 18 years ago, I kind of saw that one of the things that if you want to be resilient, you want to maximize your resilience, then you need to have one or two people in your life that you are willing to identify as a safety net. And this should be somebody that knows you really well. It should be somebody that cares about you a lot. And it should be somebody who is self-possessed. Because what I'm going to ask you to do with those one or two people, doesn't need to be more than two, and usually one's enough, but two is okay. That you step to them sometime over the next couple of weeks and say to them something like this: hey, I just learned that I'm high risk for secondary traumatic stress. And one of the things that I would appreciate from you, if you're willing, is in your interactions with me going forward, if you see me starting to get different than the ways that you've known me to be before, if I start becoming irritable frequently, if I become withdrawn, if I become, in any way that you're starting to see that I'm changing for what looks like the worst and not the better, it's regression and not growth, then what I would appreciate you doing is confronting me. Now, when you do that, I will not appreciate it. And I will push back. That's why you need somebody self-possessed. They need to know you well enough to know that they're starting to see you become different. They care about you so that they're motivated enough to step to that. And 3, they need to be able to do this. What I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to push back, and it's going to strain our friendship. But what I'm going to ask you to do is to continue to confront me, even though I won't like it and I'm going to be upset with you, until you hear me say to you that I'm willing to do something about it. I'm willing to change. I'm willing to address this. You may save my life. And what's cool about doing that is when a person kind of establishes that relationship with one or two people in their lives and they're encountering them regularly, what that does is that makes them much more intentional about managing their own selves. They don't go into sleepy dissociation of where they just don't look at themselves very much because they don't want to get confronted by this person. So they're doing a better job of self-monitoring. And it kind of is a win-win situation. And it's kind of, developing that network of support. So I want to urge all of you to develop a relationship with one or two people in your life that can be your safety net. Now, once you start having some of these symptoms, well, let me do it this way. The best thing to do with secondary traumatic stress is to just not get it. And how do you not get secondarily traumatized? Well, that's the really cool thing about trauma, because what causes traumatic stress is not traumatic events. Rape doesn't cause trauma. Motor vehicle accidents don't cause trauma. Combat doesn't cause trauma. What causes trauma, stay with me on this, is the encoding of that experience with a lot of energy. And it is the encoding of it with energy that now that energy, that fear, is what causes the memory to intrude and produce the perception of threat here in the present. That if you stay in a relaxed body and you have a motor vehicle accident, then you have a motor vehicle accident and it's painful and it's uncomfortable, but it quickly becomes memory. It's just back there. It doesn't intrude into your daily life. It has to require the encoding with terror. That's why you rarely work with somebody that has PTSD from a motor vehicle accident that was drunk while they were driving, because it's a CNS depressant and they just don't ever get the terror associated with it. It doesn't produce PTSD. You got to have the arousal for it to be traumatizing. So if you're able to witness trauma, if you're able to work with trauma survivors, and you're able to keep the muscles in your body relaxed the whole time that you're witnessing the trauma, then you don't encode that as secondary trauma. It's not the witnessing of it. It's the witnessing of it while you are having a threat response. David Snarsh, one of my heroes, working with kind of sexual maturation in couples. Great work he's done. And a lot of my work's predicated on that. Talks about the difference, a really nice job of the difference between sympathy and empathy. And he says both sympathy and empathy are the ability to put yourself in the perceptual framework of another person. But what happens with sympathy is that costs the loss of self, that you're totally absorbed into the story. Where empathy is that you're able to put yourself in that perceptual framework while continuing to have a clear sense of self. And I would add to that the ability to monitor and intervene with your autonomic nervous system while you're engaging with our clients. It is the loss of the awareness of your own physiological arousal and the inability to interrupt that physiological arousal that produces secondary traumatic stress. So as we're able to, the more and more of our career that we're able to stay in a relaxed body while we're at work, the less and less and less of secondary traumatic stress do we absorb. But any of you who have ever heard a rape narrative, who've ever had somebody tell you the story of being raped, ever heard of a story of a childhood sexual or physical abuse experience, and you've witnessed that narrative, man, 37 years of doing that, I still have chunks of time when I'm hearing that narrative where I am totally absorbed in it. I have no awareness of error. And I've been doing this for a long time. And there's still these brief periods when I'm listening to those narratives that turn into secondary traumatic stress. So what do we do once we get traumatic stress? Well, what traumatic stress needs is both desensitization and integration. And how do you do that? Well, you develop a network of support people in your life who you have cultivated to be a network that you regularly engage with to intentionally share the painful parts of your work while staying in a relaxed body. And as you turn that into narrative and you stay in a relaxed body while you're sharing it, what it does is it turns it into memory. It takes the sting out of the memory because you're doing exposure, pairing it with relaxation, and that dissipates the energy, and getting words around it turns it into narrative, so it now is encoded in long-term memory. It becomes memory rather than something that's continuing to intrude. So how frequently do we need to do that? Well, for some folks that are real high intensity, that may be monthly. For folks that have less intense exposure, it may be quarterly or even yearly. But we do need to have a network of supportive people that we can turn to and share the painful parts of our work in a body that is relaxed so that we can dissipate. And, we did some research at Florida State where that folks do not get tertiarily traumatized. The demand characteristics are really different when I got a friend listening to me share. And as long as I preserve the anonymity of that client, then I can share about that. As I preserve the anonymity of that client, give them a pseudonym and change the context a little bit so that it's not recognizable, and I can share to another person. They're just listening, they're eating their salad and they're listening and they're attuned, but it does not produce that activation because they don't have all the demand characteristics of helping that person to heal, of where there's such absorption, they're able to not get infected tertiarily. So you don't have to worry about hurting your colleagues about sharing that. You do have to worry about it if you hijack them and you start just vomiting over them. You definitely want to build a relationship where that becomes intentional and voluntary and invitational, where you're asking the person to meet with them or talk with them on the phone at some time in the future, and you've got a narrative of stuff that you need to share with them, and you want to give them the power to choose to engage with you and not just hijack them in the hallway and start vomiting that all over. So that's how you both prevent resilience and resolve secondary traumatic stress. Now, finishing up the kind of morning part of this workshop is the problem, and then the afternoon is the solution. This is the last piece. I'll take about 20 minutes or half an hour to do this with you. And then we'll move on to the solution. I'll go have some lunch first, though. So the second half of compassion fatigue is burnout. We did the secondary traumatic stress piece, now the burnout piece. And when I do this in a workshop, I ask, how many of y'all know somebody who's burned out? How do you know they're burned out? What types of things do you see from them? And I hear a myriad of things, of everything from one physician that said, how do you tell somebody who's burned out? He said, I look in the mirror. To things like they're irritable, or they tell you that they are negative. They are energy vampires. That they're aggressive. To the other, that's the front end. That's the arousal end of burnout. To they're flat. They're, I had somebody in California call it presenteeism, which I think is pretty cool. Like they show up, but they're not really there. They do the mechanical aspects of the work, but they're not engaged. They're shut down, they're isolatory, they're flat, and they're avoidant. So, one of the interesting things about burnout research, the first published burnout research was in 1974 by Freudenberger. And one of the very first pieces of research that were published found that people that don't care don't get burned out. And the more zealotry somebody has at the front end of the career, the more susceptible they are to burnout. Because what happens? I mean, I was certainly a zealot early on in my career. What happens to those folks? Well, they end up, they've done their graduate training. They're excited about changing the world. They're excited about helping people. And then they run smack into these institutional processes that thwart their ability to do what they think needs to happen for these people to heal. And that becomes increasingly frustrating and increasingly perceived as a threat. And they start now fighting with the system and become progressively symptomatic in that process. In the early 80s, Christine Maslach at University of California, Berkeley, started writing about publishing burnout research. And she, I think it was 1984, 10 years after Freudenberger, I think it was then, that she developed the MBI, the Maslach Burnout Inventory. Some of you may have heard about that. That is a 30-item instrument that measures burnout. And Beth Stam used a lot of the MBI, kind of synthesized some of those questions from the MBI to develop the burnout scale on the ProQual. And this was how Christine Maslach identified burnout, and it's kind of the accepted definition of burnout. It is emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and reduced personal accomplishment. Emotional exhaustion doesn't make sense to me. It's really physical exhaustion. Depersonalization is a dissociative process of where the person becomes so activated that they shut down, and where they become automatomatic, robotic, presenteeism, that where they are able to do the mechanical tasks of work without engaging. And I've written about this in other contexts, that people who are continuing to practice, especially in the world of mental health, and what we've learned with outcome studies is one of the primary factors of effective treatment in mental health is the therapeutic relationship. Well, people that are burned out are withholding the best of their best capacity for therapeutic relationships from their clients because it's too painful for them. And they are malpracticing. They are withholding the medicine that is most effective for their client's healing involuntarily and a lot of times completely unaware. But that's what's happening when people are burned out. They are not fully engaged relationally, and that's not okay. And which leads to reduced personal accomplishment, both perceptually and both in the real world, that they are not getting as much done, and they also perceive themselves as failures, as not being able to do what they were once able to do. In 1998, I was working on my dissertation at Florida State, and then again in 2003, Maslach and Goldberg did these two huge meta-analyses, meta-analytic research with burnout and burnout research. And what they found was originally they conceptualized that the cause of burnout was two factors. And the two factors that they identified as the primary cause of burnout initially were workplace factors and worker characteristics. That the combined effects of those two things were what produced burnout. What they said in both of the publications following both of their meta-analyses in 1998 and in 2003, and it's pretty much it's still ongoing today, was that they said while we originally perceived that it was these dual factors, worker characteristics and workplace factors, that were causing burnout, there is overwhelming evidence from our meta-analytic research to determine that it is primarily workplace factors that produce burnout. And you know what? That was really good research and entirely wrong. it was reliable but not valid. Because how did they get that data? They interviewed burned out people. And, you know, what do people who are burned out believe is the cause of their burnout? They believe it's the workplace, right? Yeah. Follow me on this. If you believe that the workplace is the cause of your burnout, you are a victim of that workplace. I have an ACE score of 9. I've been a victim in my life. And I had Viktor Frankl jumping up and down on my shoulder going, no, it's not the environment. It's not the environment. So I took my anger and I wrote my own definition of burnout. And I've used this definition to help tens of thousands of people resolve their burnout. The chronic condition of perceived demands outweighing perceived resources. People who are burned out, do they perceive they have lots of demands upon them, or do they perceive they have few demands? Right? Do they perceive they have lots of resources or few resources? Low resources. What do you suppose is going on in the body of somebody who perceives they have high demands and they perceive they have little resources? What do you suppose is happening in here? Chronic threat response. Would you agree? And the chronic threat response is what produces the symptoms of burnout. So, if it's not the environment, then what is it that's producing burnout? Well, what I would say, it is perception of the environment. Not the environment itself, but the perception of that environment. Oh my goodness. And I can't tell you how many people have gotten up and walked out of the trainings that I've done. I've had people get up and slam their papers down and saying that law enforcement is not the perception, it is the work. I get it. There's a lot of things that happen in law enforcement that are challenging. But it is the remaining in hypervigilance. Can you work in law enforcement and have quality of life? You betcha you can. You betcha. And what's it require? It requires not managing the real danger of law enforcement with a chronic hypervigilance, with relaxed vigilance, until you need the explosive capacity of the sympathetic nervous system, and then you bring it to bear, but you don't need it on all the time. And this is only for people who have suffered enough that are willing to take this course of action to start to, because thinking about that, as long as you believe that it's the workplace that is causing it, then how much energy, the only pathway you have framed up that can get you professional quality of life is you got to change the workplace. How successful are you getting your workplace to bend to your will? You're not. So, when we can no longer change the world, we're left with changing ourselves. And here is a pathway to be able to resolve burnout by changing that which we have power to change. And that is the perception. And there's two areas that we can change those perceptions. We can change the perception of the demands. We can change the perceptions of the resources. And the way I'll start with that is, what is the condition of real demands outweighing real resources called? It's called death. Everything else is perceptual. And, I can just hear all of the advocates just spitting venom at me. But I would hold up to you Viktor Frankl. And he had overwhelming demands. Overwhelming. That as he started to change his perception of those. That when he invited a German prison guard to shoot him, but he could not make him change what was true and right for him. He wasn't a victim. He chose. And that is subtle and important. So, how do you heal burnout? Well, it's certainly interrupting the threat response so that the situation is not causing distress, and then it's getting a neocortex back online so that you start to see it's gradual, it takes a while, but that as we are able to start to change the perception of the environment changes. That by changing the perception, we're able to help people to detoxify that environment, to make it less and less and less and less toxic for the people that work in it by shifting the perception of it. So this perceptual maturation is what we've called this process, leads to resolution and then on to resilience for future situations. And I want to walk you through a couple of those. And that'll finish us up for the problem. And this actually starts to get into the solution as we get into the resilient skills in the afternoon. There's 5 of them. And one of those resilient skills, the third one, is perceptual maturation, is beginning to change the way that we look at the environment to make it less damaging to us. We've already done that. Hopefully you've been with me on 2 of those. Well, we've already changed. I've done some perceptual maturation work with you guys already of helping you to see, of moving what most people perceive as an external causation into an internal locus of control. That it is not the coworker who is stealing my lunch that is causing my distress. It's what's going on in my body when I discover my lunch not being there. It does not require a threat response for me to navigate through. I'm not in any danger when somebody steals my lunch. And I can decide now with some space between stimulus and response and the neocortical functioning, I can decide how to deal with that. I can become intentional about dealing with it and not generate symptoms as I move through it, as I see that, as I shift out of controlling them to controlling myself in that situation. And the other thing that we've done is mostly, a lot of you, I don't know most of you, but my experience is that most people who come to the workshop, they've never looked at the difference between real versus perceived threat. That what's happened is every time that they've been afraid, they believe they've been in danger. That's just been an automatic process. I'm afraid, there must be danger. And then they respond to the environment as though it is dangerous. But what's already started happening is this really dangerous? Is that capacity for neuroception? Is, just because I'm afraid, is there something really dangerous in this environment right now? No, just you guys are evaluating me and looking at me, and that's scary as hell. So I perceive this camera up on the wall as something threatening. I'm not in any danger right now. None, zero. But I am constantly perceiving a threat while I'm sitting here talking into this camera. So those are 2 that we've already kind of looked at. And what that, I hope that you can see that shifting these 2 perceptions, man, what is that? I don't know, 30%? 25, 30%? Maybe more of the environment, of the toxicity of the environment just went zoop. It just became a whole lot less toxic environment. Once I see that it is not the traffic that is causing my distress when I'm driving. It's not that out there. It's what's going on in my body. And it's where I put my attention where I have power and I relax the muscles of my body while I'm driving, then I am no longer in distress while I'm driving, and driving's not stressful anymore. Isn't that cool? That's power. It's that simple. It's not that easy, as we're going to get into when we start talking about the skill of self-regulation. So this is the way that we detoxify our lives, is by starting to update our software. But you can't update the software unless you got a fully functioning cognator. And what's happening with most of us is we're walking around in a threat response all day long, so we have diminished neocortical functioning. So we go, no, that's not true, is that we're in such a perceived threat that we can't change our perception. So it takes a little while of practicing self-regulation before perceptual maturation starts to bear fruit. That's why I have 10 pages, no, actually more than that. I think I have 13 pages written in your manual about perceptual maturation, because what I've known is that this is going to be stuff that is going to become much more useful 2 weeks down the road than it is for you today. But let me unpack a couple more of these. I'll do a couple now, and then I'll do a couple when we get to perceptual maturation at the end of our day. And this one's a big one. Is demand versus choice. So how many demands do you have at work? How many demands are upon you at work? And folks almost always say a lot. And I chuckle and I go, okay. Are you willing to evolve that perception? What? So let me give a demonstration. And when I do that live, let's say that it is that Carl's sitting here and Jennifer's sitting here. Carl and Jennifer. And I say, okay, here's the difference on this. And let me give you an illustration of how this is different, of demand versus choice. So we go to lunch. You know, it's lunchtime, and you're at work, and you look down, or let's say it's during a live training. That's the best way I can do it. And we adjourn for lunch, and both Carl and Jennifer, as they're walking out of the room and headed to go to lunch, they look at their phone, and their phone has a voicemail from their supervisor, the person they report to. And they play the voicemail and they listen to it, and it is their supervisor saying, "Oh, I forgot. There is a report that I need from you on my desk at 8:30 in the morning. It's got to be there. Get it done. Get it on my desk. It's absolutely essential that you do this." Real demand or perceived demand? And it's when I do that in a live training, it's like I set the person up on a stool and I took a little red mallet and I said, real demand or perceived demand? Real. That's a real demand. No, it's not. It's a real demand from your boss, but it's not a real demand yoked on you. And here's where people start crossing their arms and looking at me with constricted orbicularis oculi, which are the muscles around the eye. And I say, okay, hold up. Don't dismiss this yet. Let me walk you through, unpack this, and you see what's true. So Carl perceives it as a demand that he has to do that report. And he had plans this evening to go with his family to movie or do something fun. And what do you suppose is happening to the rest of his day? Once this is sprung on him, he's probably going to have a bad day for the rest of the day. Sneers crawling up his face. He calls his wife and says, we got to cancel that thing. I got this report I have to do. Notice the language there, have to do. And he spends the rest of the day sour. And he gets home and he has dinner with his family and he's upset and he's not talking to anybody. And everybody's little mirror neurons are reading his upset. So they're all on pins and needles. And that they become irritable and snarky around the table. And it's just an awful place around that dinner table. And then he gets up, slams his dishes in the sink and goes and sits at his computer and writes that report. Symptom generation all day long. He's been generating symptoms, progressively diminishing his quality of life as he's gone through the day. Now, Jennifer gets the same supervisor, same message, and she goes, "Oh, a report due tomorrow. There's nothing I can do about that right now. So you know what? I'm going to set an alarm for 6:30 this evening, and I'll deal with that then." And she sets an alarm on her phone, notification, and she doesn't think a thing about it for the rest of the day. Goes on with the rest of her day, goes have lunch with her colleagues, comes back, finishes the workshop, and then gets home this evening and has dinner with her family, and it's light, and they're having fun. And then 6:30, she's cleaning up after dinner, and the alarm goes off on her phone, and it says report. And she goes, "Oh, yeah, that damn report. What about that? I don't have to do it. And there'll be some consequences from it. My boss will be upset with me. But she sprung it on me in 12 hours, and I'll be able to certainly produce excuses of how I couldn't get that done, and I'll be able to renegotiate that to be done for later in the day or tomorrow, the next day. And it'll cost me something, for sure. If you're working at a place that you're going to get fired because you don't do a report that's sprung on you in 12 hours, then it's best you go ahead and get fired from that, because it's such a coercive environment, you're probably not going to be able to be very healthy in that environment. But she goes, let me think about that for a second. I signed a contract, so, this is under my job description to do that. So, on one level, I am kind of obligated to get that done. And you know what? If I do it, then it's going to earn me some cred with my supervisor. I'm probably going to get able to have first dibs on when I want time off. And you know what? It aligns with my integrity to do it. And I don't want to do it, but it plays out better for me. I have better outcomes in my life if I do it rather than not do it. So I'm going to do it. And she excuses herself from her family, and she goes, spends an hour, sits at the computer, relaxes the muscle of her body, types up the report, gets it done. No symptom generation. Symptom generation from Carl, none from Jennifer. You videotape them writing the report. They're doing the exact same things, but those are two completely different professional lifestyles. This is the perception that we are yoked with our job responsibilities. There is Jennifer realizing that she always has choice. Always has choice. And that's the cool thing about being an adult. So let me give this gift to you if nobody else ever has. Nothing is demanded of you ever again. You are free. You're free. So do a task or don't do a task at work, but don't do it because it's forced upon you. Do it because you have chosen to do it. I'm not preaching subversion here. And mostly you're probably going to decide to do the task, but you're doing it from a place of choice rather than from a place of conscription. Internal versus external locus of control. And there was the shift in the perception that that is not a demand, that I am always at choice. One of the folks that we worked with that was a PA, a physician's assistant, working in Richmond, California. I don't know if you're familiar with Richmond, but it's a suburb of Oakland, San Francisco. And it's pretty high crime, poverty. And she was lamenting pretty frequently about how bad things were and was about to, this is a beautiful story, about to leave the job there because of how much it was hurting her. And when we did this part, when I trained those folks, she shared that she thought about that and spent, a week in contemplation on that. And she said, you know what? This is my mission, is to work with in this community and help these people have better lives. And what I got to was that this is the cost, that this environment, which is demanding and few resources and there's not very much to work with, this is the lot. This is what it costs for me to get to do my mission. And you know what? I choose to go back there and not be a victim in that circumstance and situation, and do the best job I can and bring the best healthcare I can to those people that don't have very much resources. Moves me. That perceptual shift changed. Nothing changed. It still was pretty horrible working conditions, but because she was no longer in a place of where it was conscripted upon her, and now it was her choice, that it shrunk down significantly the perceived threat and the symptom generation capacity of that environment. That she changed the environment by changing her perception of it. And I think that's pretty profound. And it's something that you could only do if you are consistently interrupting the threat response, because it requires for you to see things differently, to language things differently internally. And you can't do that with a diminished neocortex. I'll address the other ones of these when we get to perceptual maturation and the resilient skills in the afternoon. And that comes next as we move into the solution.